Hello everyone, today we're going to continue our discussion of Unit 8 on aquatic and terrestrial pollution. Today we're going to talk about solid waste, which is basically what you think of when you think of trash. We'll talk about where it goes, how we process it, and how we can reduce it. So solid waste is any discarded material that's not liquid or trash, can come from domestic, industrial, business, or agricultural processes, plastic, cardboard, paper, you name it. That's all what we think of when we think of solid waste. Municipal solid waste is solid waste that is collected from mostly the things that are, or the institutions going on in a township. So homes, small businesses, institutions, etc. So municipal solid waste excludes things like industry and agriculture. It's mostly focusing on homes and small businesses. So if you see this term municipal, you can just think about homes and small businesses. So waste produced by a nation correlates directly to its wealth. So the wealthier that a country is, and generally speaking, the more waste that it tends to produce. As you can see in this graph, we've got municipal waste generation in kilograms per person per day, and we've got the GDP per capita per PPP as well. So you see that as the amount of waste produced per person increases, the wealth tends to increase as well. And that's not really a surprise when we think about the carbon footprint and the ecological footprint and how that equates to wealth. But it's also because we're a throwaway society. We use a lot of single-use plastics that meaning that we use them once and then we throw them away. And also we've been industrialized for a while now, which means that we have new technology to access new types of material and new types of energy. Plastics have really only been around for about 60 or 70 years or so. And we also have seen a cultural shift prioritizing convenience and speed and outsourcing and externalizing costs, such as shipping much of our waste overseas. And you could see this if you look at the fact that Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and Nestle are the top plastic polluters for the third year in a row. In this article, they have a quote that basically says that up to 91% of all the plastic waste ever generated has not been recycled and has ended up incinerated in a landfill or in the natural environment. So not only are we producing a lot of single-use plastics like Coca-Cola bottles, but a lot of it isn't even getting recycled. So how does our industrialization lead to developing countries increasing their municipal solid waste? Because obviously, as we get wealthier and continue to industrialize, we'll increase our MSW, but we actually find that we're having impacts on other countries as well that are less developed. And that has to do with the fact that we are exporting our waste to these countries, right? We're externalizing the costs. So rather than having to pay to dispose of or treat this waste in the United States, we're shipping it to other countries. For a while, we shipped much of our waste to China, but China recently stopped accepting waste, saying that they don't want to be the garbage dump of the world. So now we're shipping much of our waste to Malaysia, Indonesia, and Kenya instead. In 2019, 180 countries signed something called the Basel Convention, which basically agreed to stop international exports of plastic waste, to stop basically offloading your trash onto other countries, and the United States did not sign that agreement. And so what we see is a shift in the exports of plastic towards other or less developed countries than the United States. So that's kind of an environmental justice issue on a global scale. And in the United States, there is a lot of waste. Enough tires to circle the planet 3 times every year, enough diapers to reach the moon and back 7 times, 8.6 metric tons of styrofoam peanuts, 2 billion disposable razors, enough carpet to cover Delaware annually, 186 billion pieces of junk mail, enough office paper each year to build a 3.5 meter high wall from New York City to San Francisco. Of the, I don't know why this is down here, this should be up here, but of all that junk mail, half are thrown into the trash unopened, so it's just totally wasted. I know I don't open my junk mail, although I do recycle it. And 6 metric tons of construction debris. So a lot of waste in the United States, and you can look at the breakdown of what that waste is. 27% is paper and paperboard, 14% is food waste, 14% is yard trimmings, right? All of this stuff is recyclable. All of this stuff is recyclable. So if instead of throwing this in the trash, we were able to recycle it, we'd be able to cut down our waste substantially. 13% is plastics, and a variety of other things make up the remainder of the solid waste. So where does all this trash go? Most of it ends up in a landfill, which you've probably seen before or driven by. These are the most common end result for municipal solid waste. This is where most of it ends up. Basically what they do is they bury the trash in the ground, and over time it will decompose. And depending on the type of trash that's in there and the conditions of the landfill, it will decompose at different rates. Landfills are problematic environmentally because they can contaminate groundwater, which we drink. They can release greenhouse gases like methane through anaerobic respiration. They're also extremely unsightly, smelly, and they lower property values. So it's not exactly a great feature to have in your community in terms of environment and aesthetics. And like I said, depending on the composition of the trash in the landfill and the conditions needed for the bacteria in that landfill to actually decompose the trash, it can take different amounts of time for this trash to decompose. A train ticket or a piece of paper might take 2 weeks. An orange peel takes 6 months to decompose. So if you're throwing your bananas out on the trail when you're on a hike, throw your banana peels out to the side thinking, oh, it'll decompose. It actually takes much longer than that. It'll take 6 months for it to decompose. Meanwhile, if you look at something like plastic bottles, could take hundreds and hundreds of years. Here's a picture of a sign outside of a wilderness refuge in New York. I forget which one, but they show you how long it will take different things to decompose. Piece of paper, 2 to 4 months. An orange peel, 6 months. Nylon fabric, 30 to 40 years. A tin can, 80 to 100 years. A glass bottle will take 1,000,000 years. Things like microfilament line and styrofoam will not decompose ever. So depending on the trash you've got in the landfill, it'll decompose at different rates. One of the largest landfills in the United States, in fact it is the largest one, is Puente Hills landfill in California. It's so large, it has its own ecosystem and nature preserve built onto the facility. The energy that is generated from the anaerobic respiration that's happening inside this will generate methane. That methane can be captured and burned for electricity, and that electricity from Puente landfills powers 100,000 homes, holding 130 million tons of municipal solid waste, which is about the weight of 15 million elephants. That's a lot. And in fact, some of the only man-made structures visible from space are landfills. Not the Great Wall of China, but landfills. That's kind of a depressing thought. Now, a sanitary landfill has a couple different major components you should be familiar with. First of all, we've got the trash, which is these green things here, and we've got a landfill liner. This liner is going to help protect the groundwater, so that way any chemicals that leach out of the trash will not end up in the groundwater. Oftentimes, these are made of plastic, but they can also be made of soil. Usually, the soil they use is clay because it has a low permeability and a high porosity. You've got a clay cap on top as well to prevent leaking. And you've got something called a leachate collection system. Leachate is contaminated water that passes through the municipal solid waste and can end up in the soil and in the waterways. So it's usually filled with toxic chemicals. So they've got a system to collect that leachate and then a system to treat it and clean it as well, or store it long term. And additionally, like I said, anaerobic respiration is happening in this landfill, meaning that bacteria are breaking down this trash through decomposition, but because there's no oxygen present, because it's so packed tightly, they're doing anaerobic respiration, which produces methane. That methane can be captured and burned, but it can also be released into the atmosphere. So it depends on whether or not they've got a methane recovery system. And additionally, not shown here is a stormwater collection to prevent too much runoff from gathering around the landfill. Here's another diagram showing similar thing. You can see layers underneath. You've got the garbage, but then you've got a layer of sand. You've got a synthetic liner. You've got some more sand in the clay. You've got the leachate being pumped out and stored and then eventually treated. And you've got methane gas recovery as well to store and generate electricity. Some things landfills will not accept. These are what I like to call no-no items, but they are not accepted by the landfills, and because they're regulated probably by the RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and they include things like rubber tires, which are breeding grounds for mosquitoes. Water can build up inside the tires where mosquitoes lay their larvae and lead to mosquito-borne illnesses, such as malaria, Tripoli, or West Nile virus. Thankfully, there are certain landfills and facilities that do take a lot of these illegal materials, such as Holly Hill, which is in Greenwich. It's a resource recovery facility, and they take a lot of things, including batteries, books, construction and demolition debris, dead animals, electronics, fluorescent light bulbs, propane tanks, recyclables, medical waste, scrap metal, tires, mattresses, you name it. It can probably be dropped off at Holly Hill. There are a couple things they don't take. Commercial medical waste, like from a hospital, hazardous waste that's flammable, toxic, corrosive, or prescription medicines. Holly Hill also recently, and as of 2021, started a food scrap recycling program. They accept all food, including meat and dairy, tea bags, flowers, paper towels, etc., for composting. This reduces the amount of food being put into landfill, which reduces the amount of methane being produced. You can drop your food waste for free off at Holly Hill, or you can pay $20 for a starter kit for a composting kit, with including compostable bags. So you can call this number, or you can email this email address for more information, or you can just Google this food scrap recycling program in Greenwich. So we can reduce the size of landfills by composting, for one thing. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a little bit. But the big thing is we want to produce less trash. Right? The saying you've probably heard a million times is reduce, reuse, recycle. Well, reduce, we say that first, because the best thing that we can do is reduce the amount of waste that we produce. Then we want to restore the habitat. For example, landfills can be restored and turned into parks, or even returned into the original habitat. We can also combust that methane that is being released from the landfill to generate steam, turn a turbine, etc., generate electricity. But we can also incinerate the waste itself, which will dramatically reduce the amount of trash, but it does produce air pollution. About 1% of Connecticut's energy comes from landfill incineration. Like I said, it reduces the amount of solid waste, but it produces a bunch of air pollutants that can affect the climate and our health by breathing them. And it requires oftentimes oil or natural gas in order to burn the waste, so we're using more fossil fuels in that sense as well. Here's a picture of an incinerator, and here's a diagram. Electronic waste is another form of solid waste that gets its own special category because of recent developments in electronic technology. Cell phones, computers, TVs, etc. oftentimes will contain hazardous chemicals, lead, arsenic, and mercury, and these can leach from landfills into groundwater. So e-waste needs to be disposed of in its own particular fashion. I know that Apple has a recycling program. You can send your phone in to be recycled, and they will pay you for it. I got $65 for my old iPhone 6 a couple years ago, so it's a profitable program for you and for the environment. 70% of all toxic materials in the United States come from e-waste, so it's a rising problem that we need to make sure that we're paying attention to. Again, we want to reduce the amount of electronics that we're producing and wasting, so don't get the new iPhone every year. We want to reuse anything we have, possibly by hand-me-downs to friends or loved ones. You can give them your old computers, and then anything after that, recycle it. Don't just throw it out. Unfortunately, some people who don't store it in landfills or burn their trash just dump their waste into the ocean. And we've talked about this before. It's in the news often, especially in regards to the Great Pacific Garbage Patch caused by ocean gyres in the Pacific Ocean. This plastic can entangle wildlife, causing them to choke and die. I'm not going to show you photos. It's pretty depressing. But also salinity and UV light can break down the plastic into microplastics, which organisms can ingest and ends up in their bloodstream. And it's still such a new phenomenon that we don't really know the health effects yet. But something like 20% of all humans have microplastics in their urine, and it can even be found in places like table salt. So it quickly infiltrates the ecosystem, the global ecosystem. While most of the plastic in the garbage patches is fishing waste or fishing nets, a lot of it is also cigarette and cigarette filters, food wrappers. Straws are a big part of it, and I know there's been a big push to get rid of those recently, which is great, but also bottles and bags, all sorts of that stuff. So again, reducing the amount of single-use plastics is going to be key. So since I've spent all this time depressing you, you might be wondering, what are we actually supposed to do about all this garbage, because I'm starting to feel like garbage. So let me ask you this. If you walk into the kitchen and you see an overflowing sink, what is the first thing you're going to do to fix this problem? Hopefully the answer is not grab a bunch of paper towels and start trying to mop up the the mess, the first thing you want to do is shut off the sink. We need to stop the flow of water. In the same way, we need to stop the flow of single-use plastics into our world before we can start cleaning up the mess that's all over the floor, right? So if we take a look at this pyramid, this looks at the number of different ways we can tackle the issue of extreme amounts of solid waste, with green things at the top being the most favored and red things at the bottom being the least favored. Obviously, disposing of that waste is going to be the worst thing that we can do, but preventing that waste is going to be key. Burning that waste for energy is towards the bottom. Notice that recycling is kind of in the middle. It's okay, but it's not the best thing that we can do. We want to prevent, minimize, and reuse as much waste as we can to prevent it from even entering the cycle in the first place. Disposing it is the last option. Again, that's why we say reduce, reuse, recycle. They go in order for a reason. Reducing is what we want to do first. So buy less stuff. It's as simple as that, right? Buy less stuff, but also, pay attention to the packaging of things that you get in the mail. Like, look at all of this waste that is totally unnecessary for these tiny, tiny little things, or excessive packaging in stores. I've seen individual potatoes that are shrink wrapped at the store. It's really, really sad because it's excessive waste and it's unnecessary. But additionally, we can reuse things, hand-me-downs, thrift stores, sharing, reusable bottles, reusable bags. Those might not seem like a big deal, but they add up over time. So reusing as much stuff as you can, passing down old computers and cell phones to younger siblings or neighbors or whatever. And then lastly, we want to recycle, where we process and convert solid waste into something new. Now again, recycling is good. We should be doing it. It can reduce the demand for plastic. It consumes fewer raw materials. It reduces the amount of energy that is required for manufacturing and processing of these materials. It can reduce the need for disposal, and it decreases pollution and emissions. However, it's very energy intensive, it's expensive, it's hard to scale to large sizes, 90% of plastics aren't recyclable, and it gives the public a false sense of security. People aren't going to care as much about the environment if they feel like their recycling is saving the planet, when in actuality it's only part of the solution, right? Because the truth of the matter is there are 7 different types of plastic. This is not the recycling symbol. You see this on plastic. It doesn't mean it's recyclable. It's just telling you the type of plastic it is. It could be high-density polyethylene, PVC, low-density polyethylene, polypropylene, polystyrene, or styrofoam. And only plastics 1 and 2 are recyclable for the most part. Anything 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, just might as well throw it in the trash. You're not going to be able to recycle it, right? So ones include things like bottles, peanut butter jars, salad dressing bottles. 2s include milk jugs, detergent jugs, and shampoo bottles. But all of these are the only ones that are recyclable. Everything else, not so much. Saran wrap, the clinky plastic trays in the cafeteria, plastic bags, bread bags, yogurt cups, medicine containers, styrofoam. None of this is recyclable. Nalgene bottles, CDs, and none of it is recyclable. It can only be thrown in the trash. So we really want to pay attention to not only what plastics we're buying, but also what we're recycling. About 1/3 of our solid waste is recycled, but about 75% of that is paper and food waste. Only about 10% of all plastic ever produced since the history of plastic has been recycled. 90% of it ends up in the trash. Now that may sound bad, but 10% is better than 0, so it's important that we continue to recycle. We can recycle our food through composting. This is the decomposition of organic matter in controlled conditions. We do it at school. We do it at Holly Hill. You might do it at home. It basically makes humus, which you can use in your garden to fertilize, and you can do food, yard trimmings, paper, newspapers, etc. The only real downsides is that it produces an odor and it can lead to rodents. But if you do it right, you won't have those problems. Again, though, if we look at this hierarchy of food recovery, composting is towards the bottom. Throwing out food is the worst, and composting is the second worst. Ultimately, what we want to do is reduce the amount of food that we're wasting in the first place. And then with any food waste that we have, feed hungry people. And anything we can't feed to hungry people, feed to animals. Then use to make things like biofuels or energy recovery, burning food scraps. Right? Composting should be a last resort. But again, it's better than the landfill. So keep that in mind. There are lots of corporate recovery programs. The Patagonia has a great program. You wash your clothes, you can mail them in or drop them off at a store, and they will recycle them. Nike will regrind old shoe soles into new soles, and they also are using single-use plastics to make some shoes. TerraCycle is a relatively new company that is trying to eliminate the idea of waste, working with companies to help recycle some of these harder to recycle materials and turn them into new products. They've recycled a lot of waste, raised a lot of money, and they've also have this other program called Loop, which basically provides refillable packaging. So anything like ice cream or granola or soap or whatever, they can provide you with containers that can be reused over and over and over again. That way you're not producing waste every time you run out of your ice cream. So worth checking out those websites. Also, different unique things that you can find all around the world. People making sinks out of tires, for example. IKEA is committed to packaging made of biodegradable mushrooms. This is all mushrooms that have grown into their hyphae root structure, basically, and have dried out. So that's up and coming, which is pretty cool. And you can also restore landfills into habitats, and it can actually make a really nice, beautiful ecosystem that helps reduce other issues like invasive species because it focuses on the use of native plants. So what can you do as an individual? Like I said, buy less stuff, reuse things, including bags, bottles, and if you're like me, jokes. Support companies that help reduce waste. Try composting or signing up for a composting programming, encouraging others, call people out and remind them about their plastic use and their waste use, and take any special recyclables to Holly Hill, including batteries, electronics, mattresses. Maybe we can start a collection at school for things like expo markers, for example. But there's a lot that you can do as an individual and in our community to start making a difference. So that's all I got for you today. Bring your questions to class, and I will see you then.